This video is about changing the subject of a formula, and this is a really useful skill to have because when we're working backwards from volume calculations, we could change the subject of the formula for the volume of a sphere, which is V equals 4/3 pi r cubed, to be r, and then we can work out the radius given the volume. But it is also a useful skill for solving equations because really what you're doing when you're solving an equation is you're changing the subject of a formula for the variable. So if you have 4x plus 3 equals 12, then by changing the subject of your formula to x, you're solving your equation. So the first thing we need to do when we're looking at changing the subject of a formula is think about our inverse operations. Because basically what you're trying to do is undo what has been done to that variable. Now, if you think about BODMAS is brackets, order of, divide and multiply, add and subtract. And the reason that I've grouped the add and subtract and the divide and multiply together is because they are inverse operations of each other. So, the inverse operation of adding is subtracting. And the inverse operation of subtracting is therefore adding. Again, I grouped multiply and divide together, so the inverse operation of multiply is divide, and the inverse operation of divide is multiply. Now, if you think about squaring a number, if I said I wanted you to calculate 4 squared, you would do 4 times 4 equals 16. And if I wanted to get back to the 4, then I would need to square root the 16 to get the 4. So the inverse operation of squaring is square rooting, and the inverse operation of square rooting is therefore squaring. And this works with any power and root. So if I wanted to work out the inverse process of cubing, it would be cube rooting. If I had the fourth root of something, then the inverse operation would be to the power of 4. So let's have a look at an example. The first example we want to look at is change the subject to x. And we've got y equals x plus 7. So I want to highlight the variable that I'm trying to change the subject of this formula to. And what I'm going to do for the first step is I'm going to rewrite this formula with that x on the left hand side because that's where I want to have it in my final answer. So I'm going to write down x plus 7 equals y. And again, I'm going to highlight the variable that I'm trying to change the subject to. Now, I've got a plus 7 there. We've just discussed that the inverse operation for adding is subtracting, so I want to take away 7. Now imagine that I've got y plus 0 on this right hand side, so I'm going to take away 7 from both sides, and that means that I'm going to end up with x equals y minus 7. And that is my change the subject to x. The next example I've got b equals 4a take away 3, and I want to change the subject to a. So the a is over here as a 4a, so what my formula actually says is b equals 4 times a take away 3. So again, I want to have that variable on the left hand side, so I'm going to rewrite my formula as 4a take away 3 equals b. And I'm going to highlight my a because that's what I'm trying to change the subject to. So the first thing I need to do is I need to do the inverse process of that subtract 3. And I know that the inverse process is going to be add 3. And again, I'm going to put in my plus 0 over here, so I've got something to add my 3 to. So that means my next line of my working is 4a equals b plus 3. And it's a that I'm trying to change my subject to. So as I said at the start, it's 4 times a, so I need to do the inverse of multiply by 4, which is divide by 4. So I'm going to divide both sides by 4. So I'm dividing the whole thing of b plus 3 by 4. And that means that my answer is going to be a equals b plus 3 all over 4. Or you might see it written as A equals a quarter, and then in brackets, B plus 3. And they are equivalent, and they're both perfectly acceptable answers. And the final example in this video, I'm going to change the subject to x. So this time I've got y equals x over 8. Now, if you remember, the fraction line means divide by. So really what this is saying is I've got y equals x divided by 8. So again, let's rewrite the formula as x over 8 equals y. And highlight that x because that's what I'm changing the subject to. So as I said, it's divide by 8. So I want to do the inverse process. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 8. And that gives me x equals 8y. And now I've changed the subject of my formula to x.